Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our January 29th, 2025 Board of Douglas County Commissioners 5:30 business meeting. There are copies of the agenda by the door if anyone would like that. And our first order of business, other than that we had a work session this morning, this afternoon rather, to hear from our Emergency Communications Department and our Emergency Management Department. It's very informative. I welcome everybody to watch the recording of those. But our first order of business will be election of chair and vice chair for 2025. And so, commissioners, I would open up the floor for nominations, first for the office of chair.
This is Commissioner Reed here. Commissioners, I just want to take the opportunity this year of all years, I think, as we transition or in the process of transitioning from 3 to 5 commissioners, the expansion of representation of our county commission. I think it's a good opportunity for us to take a few minutes, have some conversation about thoughts and perspectives around the process, if you will, maybe a lack of a formal process, but this occasion perhaps is another word, annually of selecting chair and vice chair for this governing body. And in my time on the commission so far, the sort of informal practice or tradition has been to rotate between 3 members. That was relatively easy math to keep track of. It was sort of, but it's also not always how those decisions have been made for a variety of reasons. And I certainly don't think that there's anything that prescribes that there should be necessarily a distinct order, if you will. So those are some of my perspectives about that. I want to invite some conversation around ideas around chair and vice chair. I will also, while I have the floor and the microphone, acknowledge that as current vice chair, based on sort of our practice in the past, it might be expected that I would just become chair instead of just feeling entitled to that or expecting that to occur or expecting all of you to necessarily feel the same way. I just wanted to take the opportunity to open some conversation around that and welcome any ideas about how to sort of approach this conversation in the future. My hope is that it's substantive and that it can be situational of sorts, and the ability to talk about sort of the current status of the commission and interest and capacity and desire to be chair. I actually think that this year, given the moment that we're in the transition phase of getting used to us as a 5-member commission and some of the differences that might comes with for some of us, I think that Commissioner Patrick Kelly is honestly a really would be a great leader in that space. I think that Commissioner Kelly's experience on boards and the breadth of different types of boards, including this commission for the past you're in year 6, is that correct, Commissioner Kelly? That in addition to elected office, being on other appointed boards and commissions, planning commission, et cetera, that he just has a real depth of experience in helping facilitate a meeting, which is what I perceive as the primary role and responsibility of the chair year after year. So I personally think that Commissioner Kelly would be a really great person to help us move through meetings in this year and some of that. And I also think that we work together as a team at the county, that's historically been true. And obviously, you know, vice chair would fill in and run a meeting if chair couldn't be here, et cetera. And that there are not necessarily any other prescribed roles or duties that are assigned to the chair. It doesn't come with any more power than the rest of us, other than the power to sort of start and run and adjourn the meetings. So that's just where I'm at personally in this conversation, and I wanted to start the conversation since I am currently vice chair. And I know that traditionally that has meant there's some deference perhaps or expectation that I might become chair or be interested in it. I personally think that Commissioner Kelly is the best person for the job in this moment right now, but certainly interested and open to other dialogue before making a formal motion, because I think part of this process is also, it's healthy for boards like ours in nomination processes that we should all feel free to make whichever nomination we think is best and appropriate for our board. And we should also each feel free to not accept that nomination for whatever reason and not feel obliged to move forward in that way. And that then, we have a voting process based on those nominations. But prior to the formal vote, I'm interested in any other feedback or thoughts that fellow commissioners might have.
I appreciate, especially from a vice chair, kind of those thoughts and that openness and humility to have that further conversation. I do think this is the right time for us to kind of, as five, talk about what traditions or habits or, do we want to have in terms of nominating leadership. And I think that, recasting that every year rather than an expectation is healthy and smart. And especially as we have, commissioners, including myself, I'm still growing in the role also, that will decide, what level of leadership is wanted, either individually or collectively. And I would say, from my own part as chair, I am glad for someone else to elevate one of my colleagues to take that role for the moment, for the next year. So I appreciate all of your comments and would be glad to hear if there are others who would like to weigh in prior to nominations, or I think we might be getting one soon.
I also appreciate the opportunity to cast a vote every year. So I do think that provides us the opportunity to have this dialogue and to determine who might be the best individual to lead each year, since we do know that every year circumstances change and as leaders, how we are leading and what we need to lead will actually change every year. So Shannon, I appreciate your thoughts and your words, and the fact that even as current vice chair, that you're willing to step aside and seek a leader to lead the five of us this year. And I appreciate your nomination of Patrick. I obviously have not been a commissioner in the previous years. So I've not been at this table or had the privilege of seeing Patrick lead as the three of you have seen him lead. But I would appreciate the opportunity to be led by Patrick and to have the opportunity as a new commissioner to have the privilege to listen and learn over the next year.
Patrick likes it when I say it's all been said. So I won't say too much more, but I would support Patrick to be the chair this coming year.
Thank you, Shannon, for getting us started, because I do think it should be a conversation every year. And I want to be clear, everyone on the commission has the skill to do what's needed as chair. And I think sometimes it's about where you are in your point in life and what other responsibilities that you might have, because there is maybe a little bit of additional prep work that goes into being chair. But other than that, I think really historically what we've seen on the commission is that the chair's role is to facilitate the meeting, sometimes to speak on behalf of the commission, but beyond that, the agenda is set through our county administrator. And so anyone here could do that job. I do think, just from experience, it is good to have a little bit of experience. Due to having experience, it takes a little bit of time. It's good to have that little bit of experience and knowing the role. And I also think something that we should continually talk about is being a chair when you're running for office, and that will happen for three of us, is something that can create some challenge. As all of us know, running a campaign is a very arduous task. And I think just the added responsibility of being chair can add to that. That being said, I want to recognize Commissioner Willie's excellent work this year as chair. We've had some of the longest meetings. I think added up, we've probably met longer than any commission in time for Douglas County. I don't know, we'll have to go back to the historical records of that, but some of those meetings have been extremely long and extremely emotional, and I really appreciate Commissioner Willie's work this year as our chair.
Thank you. I would accept any nominations we might have for chair. Seems like we might have one coming.
It's Commissioner Reed again. Thank you for those comments and all commissioners, and also meant to and want to take the opportunity to acknowledge that it was a difficult year for a lot of reasons, in part because we were not in this room. We moved between spaces. There were a lot of changes and accommodations and differences to this past year. And I really appreciated your leadership in that space. And with that, I would like to nominate Commissioner Patrick Kelly to be chair for 2025 for the Board of County Commissioners.
I'll second that motion.
I believe we have a motion and a second. Do we have any further discussion? And that would include any further nominations. Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would you care to run the nominations for vice chair, or shall I finish that part out?
I think we can probably finish that out, and I'm going to make I would recommend Commissioner Reed if she's interested in being vice chair. I think, again, it sort of breaks the habit of, that you can't be vice chair twice. I mean, you could be chair twice, right? That's something else that we could do. I think Commissioner Reed has been our chair while I've been on the commission and done an excellent job. I think our two new commissioners, Commissioner Dorsey and Commissioner Anderson, would do a fantastic job. But I do think there's some benefit to having that year of experience just to flow through that. So that's where I'm leaning towards, but I'd be interested in more conversation.
Is that a motion?
Not yet, just discussion.
Oh, okay.
I fully agree. I would be very comfortable with leadership from any of my colleagues, but I would be very glad to have Commissioner Reed continue in that role if she's willing. But I would also open up to other thoughts, discussions.
I'm also in favor of Commissioner Reed serving as vice chair.
Ditto.
Thank you, commissioners. Yeah, I would be glad to continue to serve in this role and to work as a team with Commissioner Kelly through this year.
So I'll make a motion to appoint Commissioner Shannon Reed as vice chair of the Douglas County Commission.
Second, do we have any further discussion or other nominations to consider? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. We have a new chair and vice chair, and we'll get to switch seats now.
The ceremonial swap. Oh, yeah. No, I'll do the name.
So thank you, commissioners. I do need to read our public comment statement. Welcome everyone to our January 29th, 2024 Board of Douglas County Commissioners 5:30 business meeting. Paper copies of the agenda are available for those who are here in person, and the full packet is available on our website. First, we'll have our consent agenda. We have a number of items on there, and then we'll follow the consent agenda with the general public comment. We welcome general public comment for addressing issues not on today's agenda, but otherwise related to county business. Given our limited time and the need to have an orderly and efficient meeting, we apply certain rules regarding public comments. We will do our best to enforce these rules consistently and without regard to the point of view expressed by the speaker. First, each speaker will be limited to a total of 3 minutes of speaking time. However, we will accept public comment of any length in writing. Individual speakers may not donate unused time to other speakers, and all comments must be addressed to topics within the jurisdiction of the County Commission. Finally, we reserve the right to mute or remove any speaker whose comments are threatening, aggressively hostile, or belligerent. Campaigning for public office during the public comment period is not allowed. Please give your full name and address for our meeting minutes and address your comments to the Commission. Please know that the comments received by the Commission during our meetings do not necessarily represent the views of Douglas County government, but we value the input. We don't usually respond to general public comment on the spot, but if you leave your contact information with county staff, we will try and get specific questions answered. After that, we'll move to our regular agenda. After our general public comment, we'll move to regular agenda. And for each action item, we'll hear from staff or the applicant, followed by questions from the Commission, and then open the item up for public comment relative to that item. Once public comment is closed, we'll bring the item back to the Commission for further discussion and a vote. Lastly, a recording of this meeting will be available on the county's YouTube page and website. Okay, with that, we'll go to our consent agenda. There are 7 items on our consent agenda. Public, you have opportunity. There are agendas in the back. Many of these items are ones we do at our very early meetings in January. Commissioners, do you have any of these items which you'd like to pull for further discussion?
I had a couple of questions, but I've already had them answered, so I don't prefer to pull anything.
Thank you. Any others? Okay, seeing none, is there any member of the public here or online who'd like to pull an item from our consent agenda? None here at the courthouse. Sarah, anyone online? And no one online. With that, I'd accept a motion for the consent agenda.
Motion to approve consent agenda items 1.1 through 1.7.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion?
No.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Passes 5-0. We'll move on to general public comment. Would anybody like to provide general public comment? Just a reminder, these are items that are not on our regular agenda item. None here. Anyone online, Sarah? We'll close public comment and move to our regular agenda item, which is a zoning and codes item to consider text amendment AMDT 241001 to revise home occupation standards and the registration process. Hi, Carl.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Carl Bauer, and I'm a planner with Douglas County Zoning and Codes. Before you this evening is a proposed text amendment to change standards and the review process for home occupations. So for a little bit of history here, home occupations have been within the zoning code since the zoning code was first adopted in 1966. There was a major revision to those regulations in 2000. Those are the revisions that are for the most part in place today. And those regulations, I'll go through them in a minute here. Zoning and Codes is the department responsible for conducting the review of home occupation registrations. There's an annual review, and then Zoning Codes also issues the registration certificates and also enforces the regulations. I'd also like to acknowledge that Ben Harris is here today, and he is the specific staff member who's largely responsible for those. So with those current regulations, the zoning code divides home occupations up into 2 different types. Type 1 refers to the home occupations that are entirely within a dwelling, and they may have up to 2 non-resident employees. Type 2 refers to larger home occupations. They can be entirely within a dwelling or within an accessory building. There's a size limit on those accessory buildings of 3,600 square feet. Type 2 home occupations are permitted in the Ag 1 zoning district with a 5-acre, and there's also a 5-acre minimum. A CUP is required in the other zoning districts. So zoning and code staff have conducted a comprehensive view of the existing home occupation regulations over the past several years. We presented those some preliminary results during a work session back in 2023. There have been many changes since the year 2000 when those regulations were initially adopted, or at least last updated, specifically the growth of internet-based employment and internet-based businesses. So for example, if someone wants to have a craft business like making soap and selling it on a website like Etsy, or having a professional office that's also related to an internet business, those are considered home occupations. So staff research found that there's a tremendous number of jurisdictions across the country that are becoming more and more permissive of these home occupations and allowing them to operate without any kind of formal zoning permission. This is just a very general overview of some of the other locations across Kansas, specifically some of the neighboring counties that have home occupations regulations. And I'll go through this a little more later on, and then if you have questions, I can come back to this. So after doing this research, to improve the process, staff noted several potential changes to those regulations. For instance, if a use were to move from a house to an accessory building, that would change the type of registration that would be required. If it's in a district other than Ag 1, that would require a CUP. And under the existing regulations, if a resident of a CP zoned property, that's the rural kind of residential subdivision district, wanted to make homemade soap in their detached garage, that would require a conditional use permit. So one of the proposed changes would be to open those kinds of uses up more, especially within accessory buildings, especially with those relatively low impact home occupations. The proprietors of those businesses are often unaware that there's any kind of registration requirement, and their neighbors are also often unaware that that business is even taking place in the first place. So currently there are 115 registered home occupations of various types and sizes within the unincorporated area. Most of them are in the construction field or home repair, landscaping, and there's some arts and craft ones as well. Additionally, staff is aware of at least 57 home occupations that are either unregistered or unpermitted. Many of those would require a CUP under the existing regulations. So overall, there are 5 major changes that are being proposed. The first is that type 1 home occupations would be considered a permitted use by right, provided that certain standards are met. That means by right would mean that registration would no longer be required. They wouldn't have to submit anything to the zoning codes department every year. Type 1 is mainly intended for very low impact uses. The second major change is that type 1 home occupations would be allowed to use up to 400 square feet of an accessory structure. Right now, they're not allowed to use any part of an accessory structure. They're only permitted within a dwelling. The third major change is that there will no longer be an acreage minimum for type 2 home occupations. Currently, there's a 5-acre minimum for administrative approval. The fourth major change is that the registration period would increase from annual to biennial. That would also reduce the amount of fees that registrants would have to pay. And then the fifth major change is that the maximum area of an accessory building for a type 2 home occupation would, which is currently 3,600 square feet, that would be removed. Also, some changes to the permitted use table for type 2 home occupations. It would be changing to P/C, indicating it would be a permitted use in most situations, but if it were to exceed those standards, a conditional use permit would be required. So when staff reviews a text amendment, there are certain criteria found within the zoning code that must be met in order for that amendment to go through, including, is this correcting an error or inconsistency in the zoning regulations or meeting an existing condition? Does it advance a clear public purpose? Does it affect the adequacy of existing or planned facilities, and does it result in reasonably compatible land use relationships? And finally, does it advance the interests of rural Douglas County as a whole? And staff found that each of those criteria are met. Additionally, staff looks at conformance with the comprehensive plan when processing a text amendment. With reference to the comprehensive plan, there are several places where home occupations are specifically called out, and the comp plan is very supportive of home occupations and streamlining the review process. So with that, the Planning Commission considered this item at their December 16th, 2024 meeting. They voted to forward a recommendation of approval to you in an 8-0 vote. And staff is also recommending approval of the text amendment before you and adopting the attached resolution. With that, I'm available for any questions.
Thank you. Commissioners, any questions for Carl?
Yes, it wasn't on your slides, but in reading through the regulations, it stated that for pet sitting, it would not require registration, but kennels were. And I'm wondering what's the difference between the two?
Thank you for that question. Kennels are not permitted as home occupations. A kennel or a commercial kennel is defined as 5 or more animals for any purpose. The requirement in the proposed regulation would have a maximum of 4 animals on the property at any given time.
Thanks.
I have a question. Carl, you mentioned previously home occupations were only allowed in the Ag 1 district and all other districts it would be a CUP. Is that also something that changed? Are these regulations across the board? If there is a residence, then they can occupy, they can be a home occupation?
Yes, that's something that's also changed with this, with the proposed text amendment, that this would open up having home occupations processed administratively on many more properties across the county.
Thank you. I'll have some other thoughts, but they can wait till after public comment.
I had one other question. If a business starts out in an unregistered status, but then grows to where it should be registered, how do you monitor or enforce that? Is it mainly on a complaint basis?
We generally would learn about that through complaints or through the proprietor asking us that question themselves. And then with that, we would work with the proprietor to bring that into compliance.
What does that appeals process look like? And I asked simply because I did view the December 16th meeting that the Planning Commission had. And I noted that the Planning Commissioners also had a couple of questions regarding the appeals process. And they had questions regarding who appoints that hearing officer, maybe even who is the hearing officer. And then I'm kind of curious from the Board of County Commissioners, what does that process look like?
The, excuse me, the appeals process is unchanged from the existing regulations. That's something that we didn't touch. If that's something that the commission is interested in, that's something that could potentially be discussed. But the appeals process, I'd also like to point out, it's extremely rare that it would ever come to that. I talked with other staff in our department and we're not aware of any home occupation ever having to go through that appeals process. But the appeals process would come to you, the Board of County Commissioners. You would have the option of appointing a hearing officer or someone to handle that request on your behalf.
Thank you, Carl. I have one more question. From that December 16th meeting, it also looked like the Planning Commission was also redefining the livable portion, redefined as habitable space. Has that actually already happened? Has that already been rewritten into this?
That's reflected in the draft regulations that are in your packet. Habitable space is basically defined as the areas like a bedroom or the kitchen or the living room. It doesn't include the bathroom or closets. It doesn't prohibit those spaces from being used for home occupation. Also within the regulations, it refers to 25% of that area or 50% of that area. That doesn't necessarily reflect that staff would be going out with a ruler or a tape measure to ensure that, yes, this is exactly 25%. If you take a typical 3-bedroom house, for example, say 25% of that house would be 1 bedroom. So you could use 1 bedroom as your 25% for that home occupation.
Thank you. So we're not going to be monitoring or worried about if someone wants to use storage or utility in their home to make soap and or have a home office.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Carl, I was sort of, I paused on the habitable space because it seems like we're putting a definition into a specific regulation. Does staff have any concerns about, typically we just said dwelling unit, like distinguishing habitable space? It seems like an enforcement challenge to me. Does staff have any thoughts they want to share with us on that?
Commissioner Kelly, this is Commissioner Reed. I just want to tag on a little bit because I had a similar question and I specifically, or maybe just tag on talk a little bit more about the accessory dwelling, and so there's some specifications about a maximum amount for an accessory building, for example, which by most people's standards are probably not defined as habitable or livable. So that question generated when I was watching that discussion at Planning Commission.
As far as accessory structures, we're removing the maximum area of space for type 2, but for a type 1, it's set at 400 square feet. There is a change from the existing regulations to the proposed regulations. The existing regulations allow for 50% of the area of the dwelling, allowing for 25% of the habitable space seems more straightforward to enforce, given that example that I brought up, specifically your typical 3-bedroom house using 1 bedroom for the home occupation. That's also intended to ensure that the property is used as a house first and a business second. Did that answer your question?
So it sounds like you're not concerned about this new definition that sort of has popped up in this regulation.
The definition that's included in the regulations is copied directly from the building code.
Okay, so that's not something that is specific to this regulation. It's within the building code. We just used it here. I'm good. Okay.
I have just one follow-up question. The types of businesses that fall into type 1, type 2, or prohibited for home occupations, I know one of the things we were doing was updating for as industries change. Did any of those items change from the old code to now, any of those listed types?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'm looking at Ben to see if he knows of any. I don't believe there were any substantive changes to those.
Thanks.
A follow-up question to that, I had highlighted, where I have it highlighted is page 5 of the Planning Commission report under the section C, types of uses prohibited as home occupation. And I'm not looking for an exhaustive overview of some of that discussion, but I guess to Commissioner Willie's point, was there anything new added to that section of the list or deleted is one question I had. And then otherwise, just sort of interested because I don't believe you highlighted it in your presentation, Carl, like if there was any discussion in this process among staff about whether or not any of those items well, let's just start with, are any of them newly added prohibited uses? Or did we remove anything that was previously explicitly prohibited that is now either by right or in that type 2 category? I'm just curious, and to be honest, if I would really track all the draft versions, I probably could have pieced that together, but just curious to know if there are any substantive differences.
I don't believe there are any substantial differences between the proposed list of uses prohibited and the existing ones. But I'll double check with Ben.
And then here, I'll throw one more specific thing, and this is pure curiosity on my part. Because a lot of the things that were prohibited uses sort of make sense to me without even necessarily interrogating or asking more questions about it. But the one I found curious was number 9, mostly because of the grouping. It says automobile painting, upholstering, or mechanical or body repairs. And I thought to myself, automobile painting, mechanical or body repairs, I can imagine both sometimes might include some degree of heavy equipment, but chemicals and hazardous waste, I assumed were elements there. I will acknowledge that I know absolutely nothing about upholstering, but I'm just curious to understand why that was grouped there or what particular concerns about upholstering there are to have it on this exclusionary list.
Those uses are on there mainly because, as you mentioned, there are the potential use of chemicals, also the potential for sounds, smells to go beyond the property line, also potential issues with increased traffic with that kind of use. Those are the main reasons why that's on the list. Also, as part of staff's research, automobile repairs and servicing are also similarly prohibited by their regulations.
I'll have some significant pushback on that when we get to that point in time, but don't have any questions at the moment.
Any other questions, commissioners?
Well, I guess I have one question, but it's actually directed to Commissioner Willie. What do you mean by you have significant concerns, but when we get to that point in time?
Well, I was just reserving this for more questions and then more statements to come after public comment, which.
Okay, thank you, because
That
I
was
also
mine.
have concerns regarding that as well. So simply because it's in the unincorporated area and we have a lot of individuals that engage in work related to what you just stated. So thank you.
Thanks, Carl. Appreciate all your work on this. We may have questions for you down the line. The Douglas County Commission always welcomes public comment. Let me open this item up for public comment. Is there anyone here at the courthouse who'd like to make public comment on this item? Seeing none. Anyone online, Sarah? All right, we'll bring it back to the commission for discussion. Sounds like Commissioner Willie, you have some thoughts you want to get us started with?
I'd like to start with first, I'm very passionate about this and I appreciate very much that it is here before us. This has been about a 10-year wait to get to come to this moment, and I am thrilled with so many pieces of this. And I just want to start with that. The 5 things that you listed of not requiring permitting, not needing to have type 1 permitted at all. I mean, it certainly suits the digital age, but it also suits some just autonomy and common sense over entrepreneurs. Adding a little bit of space for an accessory building in type 1, also fabulous. The 400 square feet, we can certainly talk about it, but as a starting point, it doesn't give me any concerns. The acreage minimum, I frankly hadn't thought about for type 2. Every 2 years instead of every year, I think will help not only businesses, but also our zoning code staff on workload. And then removing the size maximum on the building for type 2, which I'm also thrilled to see. I know that might be something that as we play this out, there may be some times when we come back and have to talk about that again, but and then having it be available in all districts, not just in Ag 1. I think we've really cutting through some overreach that's been in Douglas County for a long, long time. And frankly, in previous folks who have served in the roles we have now at zoning and codes, been highly abused and really created a lot of distrust because of that with some of our rural residents and rural business owners. So I am beyond thrilled that we've gotten to this point for a long time waiting and that we get to have these discussions. This is, in my mind, an excellent, excellent progress. The 2 pieces really that, which actually been mentioned already by Commissioner Reed and Commissioner Anderson, would be the prohibited uses, numbers 9 and 10, automobile painting, upholstering, mechanical or body repairs, and welding and machine shops being prohibited uses, but allowed uses are maintenance and repair of agricultural implements and equipment, assembly and repair of mechanical devices and components. And those 2 groupings feel like they're very arbitrary about where those would land. Like if it's okay to do a particular kind of work on a piece of agricultural equipment, which might be the size of this room, versus being able to do that same work on a vehicle. I'm concerned and a little distressed to see that that feels so arbitrary, and that it will, prohibit businesses that I think are an asset in Douglas County. Upholstering, you're right. That was certainly one that, like, that sewing machine just doesn't seem too offensive in the upholstering world. But I'll pitch that to other commissioners for your conversations and thoughts, and I may circle back to it.
Carl, can you just pull that slide up on the comparison? And maybe, Carl, you could just talk a little bit about what the work staff did on this at this point in terms of, what staff's thoughts were on auto repair?
Just some general concerns over potential for increased traffic, potential for storage of vehicles. Those are some just general concerns. There is a use classification in the zoning code already for vehicle repair. It's called light equipment repair and service. That's not a permitted use in the agricultural districts. It's permitted in the commercial and industrial type districts like general business, light industrial, general industrial.
So, and I think it seems like there's two items on here, the agricultural implements and equipment, and then automobiles. Is it just because these were the ones that we at one point decided this is where they should go and we didn't think of moving them? Or is there a real thoughtful reason that we would say agricultural implements can be repaired and mechanical devices can be repaired, but they can't be used? Was there a decision point there?
And part of that has to do with the equipment being agricultural in nature. Agricultural activity has certain exemptions from zoning, and that's particularly why that's in there. Additionally, there just aren't changes from the existing regulations for those lists of prohibited uses.
Could they? So let's say I wanted to do a welding and machine shop. You would have to either change your zoning to light industrial or get a CUP, or a CUP wouldn't work at all.
There is another use classification in the zoning code called a small scale industrial use that's permitted in the ag districts with a CUP. So that's also something that someone seeking to operate that type of business could go down that avenue.
Okay.
So we have a lot of youth that engage with the Douglas County with the demolition derby. And they have a lot of different vehicles, which they keep on their property, on their parents' property, which they repair, which they paint, and they do a lot of work on. Would this affect that type of work?
I don't believe so.
Are we?
For personal use, this is more related to for commercial purposes.
Okay, so what if those individuals then chose to sell those vehicles to other youth and to make money off of it to then afford what they want to do for derby and or going to other demolition derbies? Because many youth do engage in that practice.
It's my understanding that that's not necessarily regulated by the zoning code. I'll double check.
Where we get into a really fine line of we don't regulate. I can't regulate if they sell it to a youth or an older person. So eventually, if you start selling things, you're a commercial use. And that's about all we can really do is if you start selling things, it's a commercial use. I would say you'd probably have to look at certain things over the tax code to sort of decide, is it, de minimis, or are you turning it into a business? Are you, I think that gets into that.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Tanya Voigt, Zoning and Codes Director. Hello.
Thank you.
So Sarah's correct. You do need a license with the state of Kansas to sell vehicles if you're selling them and reoccurringly selling them. And at that point, that's when we would trigger, now you're a business, you need to meet all of the requirements for what you're doing. So if you've just got a vehicle on your property that's yours and you're selling or buying it, you can do that and it's not regulated.
Okay. Thank you, Tanya. And if you are a mechanic and you want to fix cars in your shop, and people bring you cars periodically and maybe you change a tire or you change oil or you fix someone's transmission, because it's what you do, you're retired, and you help people out who maybe cannot afford to go to a shop, would this affect them?
So I knew this was going to come up. This gets a little bit in a gray area. So when you look at the type 1 and type 2, that's number 9 and number 6 on those or other uses that the zoning and codes director determines satisfy the purpose of these regulations and are similar in character to the uses listed above. So if you're really small scale and you're not generating any more traffic than some other use, and no additional impacts, then at that point, we actually do have one auto repair business that's registered as a home-based business now and one welder. But they're meeting all of the requirements and the standards. So I think when the prohibited uses was added, so those were just carried over from the old regulations. I do have a couple notes because there are a few changes. So in the old regulations, it stated auto and other vehicle repair was prohibited. So the language has changed a little bit where it's talking about the upholstery. And that, the planning office helped us write these regulations. So I'm not really sure why that was put in there. I apologize. But it was a prohibited use prior. We added the commercial storage of RV and boats. That's new. Prohibited use of dog kennels was added. And then we removed the contractor equipment component, and that's now an allowed use under type 2 as contractor equipment and material storage. That's because we have so many in the county that are operating right now and they're unpermitted, and we need to find some permitting path forward for them. Auto repair, I think how we would treat that is we're really concerned any home-based business, whether you're a type 1 or 2, you've got to meet some conditions. And the reason that it's a prohibited use is it's really, really hard for auto repair to meet the activity or equipment that creates noise, vibration, electrical interference, smoke, odor, or particulate matter emission that is perceptible beyond the property line is prohibited. And that's for type 1 and type 2. And so we had a cabinet shop maker. He was creating some noise in his accessory building. We had to stand at the property line to determine whether it was audible to the neighbor, and he ended up insulating with spray foam insulation his entire garage so that the noise wasn't carrying to the neighbor. So I think that's really why we're triggering the prohibition, because we don't know, it will be hard for them to meet those thresholds as a home-based business, and it's going to require a lot of work on our end on the code enforcement side. In addition to that, as we open businesses up in the county, people leave the city. And so we're not sure at this time, if we open up auto repair completely as a home-based business, what that means for people leaving the city and deciding it's much less expensive to operate from their home site. We're just not sure what that would mean for us. So we've been a little bit on the safe side. Unless you can fall in that really low impact, we feel comfortable with you. You're not generating a lot more traffic. If you're just a retired person working on one car at a time and pulling it in your garage, we have no issues with that. It's the many cars coming in, many cars being stored on the site, a bunch of exterior storage, and all of the problems that come with that.
And if I can add just to add on, and so I can let Carl put the screen down. Also, my advice to staff is also, if we do look at our neighbors and for best practices around these issues. And if we're and as you can see from this sheet, they're prohibited in most counties. So generally my advice to staff in that situation is let's not be the first person. It's not always a great reason, but I do want to just point out that when we did talk to area counties about this, they are prohibited in most counties. So you can take the slide down now, Carl.
So I know one of the points of going back to the code for home-based business was to talk about the impacts as opposed to like we're regulating things that impact neighbors. So it's traffic, it's noise, et cetera. Exterior storage is already something that is well managed in the regulations there without saying, well, we don't think you can, so therefore we're going to prohibit this whole class of activities. That seems like a very different in intent than regulating impacts. So we've already decided, that in terms of traffic counts, that can be an issue. Exterior storage, not allowed, smells and sounds at the property line. That is regulating impacts as opposed to saying whether or not you're doing that work on a lawnmower or a tractor or a vehicle seems really arbitrary to me in terms of like the impacts are what we want to see. And the only thing I hear you saying about prohibiting those uses are, we don't think that they'll store things inside. We don't think that they'll be quiet or work with the doors closed. I think we can leave it up to the business owners to say these are the regulations and however you meet them. I would say if you have an assembly and repair shop, you surely are doing some welding. You surely are doing some machining of parts. Where do you draw the line? How much welding is a weld shop and how much welding is a repair shop? I think we're really splitting hairs to manage between those prohibited and allowed uses.
I would like to see this go back to the planning committee for it to be worked just a little bit more, for us to take a look at some of the, especially 9 and 10, some of the exclusions, maybe have it parsed out a little bit more, so that we are not, as leaders, possibly setting up a code where we'll have individuals not actually being able to do what they're already doing in the county. And so people move out into the county and the unincorporated areas to have a little bit more space and a little bit more freedom to be able to work on their cars, to be able to work on their tractors, to be able to be outdoors and to make a little bit more noise. I will tell you that my neighbors, when they're out and those kids are running their ATVs and they're making noise and their dogs are barking, it is noisy. And I smile, I'm glad. My husband's like, oh my gosh, that is so noisy. And I'm like, you know what? That is the noise of freedom. Yes, it might make others upset, but we live in the unincorporated areas and we live in the county for a reason. For freedom, for the chance for kids to do that and to make ruts in the ground and to not have an HOA and to tear up the ground and to make noise and to be kids. And so, in my opinion, this needs to go back to the planning committee.
I'm reading type 2 home occupations, item number 6, which says other uses that the Director of Zoning and Codes determines satisfy the purpose of regulations and are similar in character to the uses listed above. So if someone did feel like their automobile painting business satisfied those standards, you have the authority due to these regulations, Tanya, right, to look at it and say, yes, it does meet those, or to advise that they should go through the CUP process for ag, because it's zoned that they can do that in ag. And I think you're right there, Commissioner Anderson. Like, yes, that may be it, but we would need to go through a CUP process to determine that the conditions do not impede the neighbors, the impacts to the neighbors. So in my reading of that, it gives some room for consideration of the specific project. I understand what you're saying, Commissioner Willie, like, well, this sets it up as a negative already, right? That it's a limitation. But I'm feeling like there are ways for those who are running those types of business to meet with zoning and codes and sort of talk through what the best path is. It sounds like we might want to take a pull string out, but as I read it, it gives us some flexibility. I hear what Sarah is saying and thinking like if every other county, and some of those are much more rural than ours, is prohibiting this, what do we know that they don't know?
Commissioner Kelly, I would say that what you're talking about requires a lot of trust for a business owner to say, I have, say if it's, falls into one of those categories that's currently prohibited, say, but I'm going to bring it forward to the county so that they can tell me I can't do what I'm already doing. Like, that seems a little dicey. Maybe we're not quite there yet in terms of trust. I think there are ways we could write it that would allow for that, like understanding that there's a gray area within there, that there may be some other things that may need to be met, which frankly are already spelled out in there. But in just saying that we've given that power back to zoning and codes and everybody's gonna be okay with that, I'm not sure that I'm there. I would use as a case in point, the appeals process that nobody has used. It's because nobody knew about it. I've never talked to a business owner that thought that they had or would be willing to go through that level of process without some kind of trust about what was going on. So I don't think that was ever advertised, and it's not on any current staff or anything. I just think that's not a message that I ever heard among business owners in the rural area, that there was any way to appeal these. There was just a level of fear, and that's what we've been trying to address with some common sense updates, many of which are in here, and I don't want to take away from that. Yeah.
I do want to say, because you brought up trust in the department and fear, and I do want to say that as the commission knows, we've done a lot of turnover and we've had a lot of change, and we've done a lot of culture change with our zoning and code staff. And I think you've seen a number of applications brought to you where we're trying to work with a property owner to bring in a particular property back into compliance, not from a perspective of a hammer over their head. As we reported on the slide, we know that there are a number of businesses that are currently operating that are not, registered. But, that's why part of it is we wanted to get this kind of clarity so that we could have those conversations. And I think I want to speak for our staff that I think we've done a ton of work in that space to build a better relationship with unincorporated area residents.
And I absolutely agree. There's been a tremendous amount of wonderful and positive work to rebuild those relationships. I just think the more we can spell out, the more it kind of helps all parties with that.
This Commissioner Reed, couple of thoughts. Well, one, I want to acknowledge Commissioner Anderson's thought or idea that this be sent back to the Planning Commission. And, we, in instances like this, that is certainly an option on the table that is always available to us. And we, as the Board of County Commissioners, have the ability and the power and the authority to make recommendations to staff for direct changes based on consensus that we reach here. So I would just offer that I think that might be, in my opinion, a best path forward for addressing this particular issue that I think we're discussing. And perhaps there are some other issues or concerns that haven't quite been brought up by other commissioners yet. But I think if it is this sort of narrowly focused, that to me is an example of something that we amongst ourselves can discuss and make directions to staff. Certainly it is an option to send it back to Planning Commission. I don't know that feels like a necessary option in this circumstance, given the sort of narrow focus of what we seem to be talking about here. So just offer that perspective in terms of process. And then, I really appreciate the points being raised by Commissioner Rowley and Commissioner Anderson. And I hear what you're saying. I think that Tony even said it before, there's some gray area spaces, and that's sort of the nature of a lot of regulations, for as specific in language and prescriptive in process that we try to be. there's often some degree of gray space. So I do appreciate and highlighted those options, the language that Commissioner Kelly had read off that that gives some discretion to the Director of Zoning and Codes to determine, based on the totality of circumstances, where something best fits in a category that we have determined through this regulation. So that language does give me some comfort in this space. And while I can appreciate the idea, I think, and paraphrasing, but I think I heard, the staff acknowledge that some of those additions and the prohibited use were cautionary, is sort of the potential of some heavier impact outcomes that might come with some of these things were reason enough to add them. Does that feel like a fair characterization? Carl and Tanya, I'm seeing some affirmative head nods, but perhaps not. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have something to say, Carl?
I just had one additional thing to add that if the commission feels that the zoning code should be more permissive toward automobile-related and welding-related businesses, I would suggest that, yes, you can return this to the Planning Commission, but what you also may consider is approving the text amendment as written, and also at the same time initiating a text amendment instructing staff to do some research on how these types of businesses could be allowed in more spaces while also ensuring safeguards for neighbors.
Because they've always been prohibited. I just also want to clarify
No,
that
thank you
for
for
the
that.
record. This isn't a new prohibition. They have always been prohibited.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I thank you for that, offering that that's a process option that's available to us too. And where I wanted to circle back to was that I think I heard you say that these items, number 9 and 10, that we're sort of discussing in detail right now were not examples of new items that had been added, as I heard them described earlier. So I do think that that's an important point in this discussion. And for me, the real distinction in many of the examples that I've heard fellow commissioners sort of talk about how common or prevalent some of these uses might be. While certainly people transactionally exchange money for services in lots of casual ways, I do think that while it may be hard to define always, to Sarah's point about, if somebody sells something, it becomes a commercial use. And there are also distinctions within that are hard, in my opinion, to define in a local regulatory text about that, right? Because it just looks a lot of different ways. So for me, the distinction is somebody who has a body repair business is presumably going to have increased traffic because it is a regular part of their daily life, not a favor or an occasional periodic transaction with a neighbor or something of that sort. And I think, as with many things that we've discussed around land use and zoning regulation, that the way that our zoning and code staff enforce is based on issues being brought to their attention in the form of a complaint, concern, or question from a neighbor usually, and that I do have a lot of I have a lot of faith, and I recognize that I am not a rural resident. I am not somebody who is subject to these or facing some of these processes. So that trust is different depending on your perspective, but that our staff is really committed to unpacking the particularities of any given complaint, question, or request for permitted pathways, whatever that might look like. And so I'm not too uncomfortable with those languages. I don't, with those items listed in 9 and 10 personally, because they are not new additions. But I can understand that maybe there are some more questions to unpack about how we define those things generally. in terms of, for staff's purposes, more than anything, to be able to delineate what rises to the level of an occupation versus a practice that somebody might engage in semi-regularly and have the tools and equipment for, but not necessarily running a commercial business and receiving income based on that. So, and again, for me, the ability of the zoning and codes director to make that situational determination, I think that's the key point for me personally in this space, that I don't believe that it's so prohibitive to have these listed right now, that we've completely shut off pathways for anybody who's truly doing any of those activities as a business versus an activity that might be even semi-frequent in their day-to-day life.
I would say about 9 and 10 having been previously on this list, it was one of the things that I felt to be a flaw I hope to see corrected. So in terms of it, I mean, that doesn't necessarily give it value that it has been there, though I recognize that it is, more broad spread than just Douglas County. I would like to float some language and see if it gets any traction with commissioners that I think gets to some of the intent of what we're hearing from staff and also what we're hearing from commissioners. And that would be on the type 2 home occupations that are allowed, the list that's allowed, number 1 and 2. Maintenance and repair of agricultural equipment, implements and equipment that may occasionally also include automobiles. And the assembly and repair of mechanical devices and components that may also occasionally include welding and machining. That occasional piece kind of makes it minor, more minor to it. It's, I mean, it's not a full weld shop or a full machine shop, but that when those activities occur, we recognize that that's what flags that it can go back to zoning and codes and say, here's what we're doing. Does this fall under what you've listed here? It just acknowledges the gray of those 2 categories.
Carl, do you want to respond to the occasional language?
It's my first time hearing that.
It's my first time saying it.
Occasional, I don't think we have a definition in the zoning code of what occasional means. So that could make enforcement challenging. If you decided to initiate another text amendment to instruct staff to look at automobile and machining related regulations, we could do some more research on just how to address that.
Tanya Voigt, Zoning and Codes Director. Thank you for having me again. So temporary is also not defined in the zoning regulations, and we use it like 100 times. Same with limited. So often when we're talking about scale of things, we use limited scale to mean that it's a little bit less of a scale. And we also don't define that. So I think as long as you're comfortable with us, living in that gray space of making that interpretation of what you trust that we will use that language, how best we can, and then bring something forward to you if we don't think it's occasional any longer. Or we could also tack on a definition, but then I think we get into all those other types of uses that also don't have definitions.
And I guess I just say that because I don't want staff to be in a position, because remember, since we're mostly complaint-based, what's going to happen is a neighbor's going to complain. And if you say occasional or limited or temporary, and then they have to, then a property owner who wants to do that use is going to say, well, I am occasional. Well, I am temporary. I am limited. So I just want us to be cautious about the situation we're putting staff in. I do think temporary or limited might help a little bit in that situation, but just know that the reason why this becomes a violation is because someone complains in most cases.
I want to ask a question about process, because my understanding is that we could send this back to the Planning Commission. Thank you for offering that. We could make the adjustments here on the fly, or we could defer the item and send it to staff without having to do another text amendment. We could just say, we're going to defer it. We'd like you to think about this language or specifically around these 2 items and come back to us with some new language. We are hitting with you this on the fly, and I don't I don't always love to do that to staff. I never love to do that to staff. So that just gives us another option, because if we do another text amendment, Carl, it would need to go back to the planning commission, and I would rather it stay here and us do that work.
Given the nature of this change, it might be considered a major enough change that it would require planning commission consideration. So I also want to make that point as well.
Point, thank you.
They
Commissioner
also-
Dorsey, any thoughts on this?
I think enforcement of whatever we write is going to come down to the neighbors. And in many cases, somebody living in the rural area is going to do what they want to do. They're not reading the regulations. They're helping a neighbor out repair his car or farm equipment. So whatever we put in writing is dependent upon a neighbor complaining against his neighbor.
And I know we've acknowledged that it's intended to have some gray, and we're leaning into that. And I want to make sure that we acknowledge that, yes, we're leaning into that. It was offered, it was suggested that it's already written in there. What we have now instead is there's a complaint. Did they do any welding there whatsoever? Do they have a welder? Yes, no, it's now prohibited. We have not acknowledged a gray space in that. So I think even though that language is uncomfortable and squishy, I think that is what gets us to what staff has said was the intent of some of those, which was to have some discussions and have some learning space there, and which also builds some trust. So and I think it's probably appropriate to send it back to staff to have some of that language done. But it's a path that I'm getting pretty comfortable with, that I think addresses some of my concerns, but also let staff also be able to kind of find some uses that are not acceptable. A little uncomfortable with that, but I recognize that there's more consensus around that.
I have a question. Who makes the decision if it has to go back to the planning commission?
I believe that would be a vote that you would take. You could send specific instructions back to the planning commission saying, planning commission, we think you need to look at this specific aspect of the text amendment a little bit more and deliberate on it. And then they have the option to consider it more, send it back to you, deny.
I thought you mentioned, though, that if we modified the language here on the fly, it might have to go back to them. And what I'm looking for is who decides if we modified it enough.
So there are two options. One, you can just send it back if you want to. That's option one, and I think that's what Commissioner Anderson was talking about. You could just send it back, have them deliberate, work on it with staff. Option two, in terms of the determination whether or not this would be a more major modification without going to Planning Commission, that one, I don't know, Tanya, if it's...
That's something that I think we'd have to check with legal counsel on.
Yeah, we might have to, and I can't do that right now. So it would be one of those things that we'd probably want to talk to legal counsel and just make sure. I don't know that it would, but I guess I just want to prepare you that if the lawyer says, we think this should go back to Planning Commission, that we're upfront with you. I don't think that would be on a use, but I just want to put that little caveat out there. And I do appreciate Commission's consideration that we don't like writing language on the fly. So if we could table it and take some time to look into it further, I think staff would prefer.
Why don't we defer it then until we can get some language that everybody's agreeable with, and then check that out with legal counsel to make sure it is not substantive enough to go back to the Planning Commission.
And I would just like to make one last note that to maybe also have them re-review the exclusion around upholstery, simply because that does seem a little odd, and there are a fair amount of home-based and home occupations around sewing, so I don't know if it directly affects, upholstery, but I just wouldn't want to put any limitations or have any concerns around that. So thank you. And Carl, really appreciate your time. Tanya, really appreciate your time as well.
Okay, Commissioner Dorsey, it sounds like you put together a motion there. Did you want to make that motion?
Mr. Chair, I have one other topic if you're willing.
Sure.
All right. It's around the idea of no noise at the property line. I know there were significant conversations that staff was involved with about other things and how much noise could occur at a property line. And I wonder if it isn't worth being consistent with that as opposed to saying zero, which is, that's not something that we regulate. I don't think we regulate zero noise on anything else. So if we're sending it back for more conversations, I would just kind of ask that staff also look at what is the most consistent language around noise also. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Lee, is there somewhere in particular that you were, I don't think I picked up on that exact language or distinction. So did you notice that throughout the regulation, or were you noting a contradiction?
I believe Tanya, zoning and codes director, will flag that.
So that's in section standards that apply to all home occupations, number 8. And I believe that was carried over from the old regs as well because it's a home occupation. So for CUPs, they're exempt from the noise ordinance related to any business that's been approved by the commission. And then the commission can set thresholds like 50 decibels, 30 decibels for CUPs, and then they don't apply to the noise ordinance. But home-based businesses, traditionally, we've tried to keep noise within the property line, same as glare, all those types of things, because they're home-based businesses in a residential area. But if you'd like us to look at that, we certainly could.
Yes, I would also like you to take a look at that because one of the, because you just mentioned in a residential area. So when we take a look at the unincorporated areas or the county, I would not consider that to be residential simply because of the footprint. And so, yeah, if we could take a look at that, please.
And I just want to clarify, I just want us to make sure we're being consistent with other parts of the zoning code related to noise, because, I mean, we have parcels on an acre. So, I mean, that's pretty, residential. It depends on how you view it. So I just want to make sure that we wouldn't be allowing home occupations to make more noise than we're allowing a normal use. And I don't think that's what the commission's intending, but I just want to make sure we're getting clear direction.
And when we're discussing noise, that has nothing to do with the normal residential use noise. So your ATVs, you're playing, swimming, those types of things, those are just normal residential uses. This would be noise associated with the business only.
Business.
Okay. Send it back to Commissioner Dorsey. Do you want to make a motion on this, or do you want us, do you, Commissioner Willie, sounds like she might have a motion cooking over there.
I will if you'd like me to. I move that we defer action on, I didn't pull it when I said I would. Wasn't as ready as I thought.
I move we defer action on text amendment AMDT-24-1001 that was revising the home occupation standards and registration process to consider items raised by the commissioners at the county commission meeting.
Second.
I have a motion and a second, and I'm checking in with Sarah and our director of code, zoning and codes, to make sure that's what you needed. We have a record of it, or do you need us to be more specific?
I just want to check that staff feels like they have the information they need to go back from here. And obviously, if we had need further clarification, we always come back to the commission.
Okay, motion seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? None. Passes 5-0.
If I
Thank
may
you,
say,
everyone.
thank you so much for the work here, and I appreciate the discussion from colleagues and from staff.
That concludes our agenda items for today. Next up is appointments. I know we have 2 appointments, 2 applications for appointments and recommendations for the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. I want to check in with commissioners. I'm ready to move ahead with that. Commissioner Willie, everybody's ready. I'm happy to make a motion. I'm going to make a motion to appoint Doris Ricks to the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Aye. Passes 5-0. I'll make a motion to approve Timothy Shoulderblade to the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
As opposed? Passes 5-0. Sarah, to my knowledge, that's the only appointments. I mean, we have some other appointments to make. Commissioners, do any of you have other appointments you need to make tonight?
I will probably be ready next week for a Kanawaka Township appointment to the Fair Board.
And I've got another application to send you for property crimes. So
And I'm happy to reach out to K-State Reach and Extension for a Food Policy Council nomination if the commission is fine with that.
well, and normally staff takes care of that. So I'm sure that Connie and Kim are working on that.
Excellent. Thank you.
So no other appointments, commissioners? Okay, we'll move on to Commissioner or Administrator Miscellaneous. And typically we start with Sarah's memo. Sarah, take it away.
Thanks, commissioners. Attached is my updated memo. The big scheduling update that I want to make sure commissioners are aware of is that we have scheduled the annual township meeting for Thursday, February 20th at 5 o'clock. It'll be at the Public Works Building. Let us know if you plan to attend because we do serve dinner. So that way we got enough food for everyone. So that'll start at 5. Okay. And it's just a good opportunity. The agenda is generally very road and rock focused, but it's just a great opportunity to see some of our township friends. Updated too, I wanted to let you know we received within the last 24 hours an updated memo from Lawrence Douglas County Public Health related to some federal funding for programs that they have. So we've attached it into your packet just so you can see some of the federal funds that help fund their efforts. We also, to follow up on an item in my memo from a couple weeks back, we got the additional information related to the Housing Stabilization Collaborative payments by city and zip code. So that's a follow-up piece of information commissioners asked for before. And you've got your week 2 legislative update from Little Government Relations. Next week, we do have a work session similar to what we had earlier today, a department overview on criminal justice services. And commissioners, that's all I have. I do have a couple other items I know we should talk about in miscellaneous, so maybe I'll just tee them up, and then I know you guys may have others. Generally, when we appoint chair and vice chair, we talk about appointments to boards and commissions. So I think that's something that we need to talk about. And also have had a request to try to schedule a joint meeting with the Eudora City Council. And so I have some information on that, and I'd like us to look at dates if we can for the first quarter. So I've got, commissioners.
Thank you. We do need to talk about board appointments. I am ready to let go of the, I want to get the name right, the MPO group. That's a group that meets to look at transportation issues. And was hoping that Commissioner Dorsey would be willing to take on that role for us.
Yeah, I'm willing to pick that up.
So I don't know that we need a motion to do that. We'll just make that happen. Commissioners, any others that people are wanting to move around?
Commissioner Kelly, will you remind us what other boards you're currently on? I can't recall if it's one
Yeah.
or two more.
I would like to be, I am currently on the EDC and I would like to stay on there, and I'll take a little bit of a bird walk here. I also serve on the chief elected board for the local area workforce. My little bird walk is we also got mention of how federal funding impacts our workforce and those grants. It would have a pretty significant impact. As we know, things have changed today. But I have really appreciated working with that group. We've been able to bring some support for more CNAs in Douglas County and in other counties in Kansas. There's been a lot of changes, as I've shared with commissioners recently, with how that area is together. So those are the two boards I would like to stay on if possible.
Thank you. It's Commissioner Reed here. I currently sit on the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, CJCC, and our E-community, the entrepreneurial community for Douglas County. I'm very interested in staying on CJCC for at least another year and continuing to participate in the process of, we just did a bylaws rehaul and, or overhaul and a strategic planning process that's really kicking into gear. So I'd like to stay on CJCC, but as much as I love E-community, and I know I'll still see those folks and organizations in lots of other spaces, and I think that that would be a really great group for one of our rural, predominantly rural-based commissioners. So Commissioner Anderson or Commissioner Willie, I think either one of you would be really great to serve on the E-community if you've got interest. And those are every other month meetings, and it's a convening of a large group. And then there's also some additional kind of periodic loan application meetings for specific Network Kansas program.
Commissioner Reed, I'd be interested in serving on E-community. Thank you.
I've been serving on the KU Innovation Park Board. I'd really love to stay if the commission allows that for another year. And I am serving on the Downtown Management Inc. Board that has never met it's now defunct.
Destination management.
Destination
Yeah.
Management. Either way, they haven't met in the time that I have been willing to serve on that board. And I don't know that we're appointing anybody to it. I think it's defunct until they tell us otherwise.
Well, I would say you're still appointed unless if it's ever activated. So they are not meeting currently, but I don't know that they've officially dissolved. So I wouldn't want to say that. So, but
I'm willing to keep that unless anybody else would like it.
I think that's it for our board appointments for right now. Yeah,
yes,
it's
thank you,
really-
commissioners. That's helpful.
For those of you out there, it used to be a much longer list. The city revised a number of its boards recently, which has impacted our
Mr. Chair,
engagement.
the Lawrence Douglas County Health Department, was there, or the CHIP, was there some ability to put a commissioner on that? I don't know if that.
Do we have a formal request for that, Sarah, yet? Or is that just something that's?
We're looking into it. I'm looking to, the city of Lawrence has a elected official on the CHIP. They've never approached us for that. So it's a conversation I'm having with the director of Lawrence Douglas County Public Health about that. I don't know if it would need to be I don't know if it's going to require a formal motion, but I know that Commissioner Anderson is definitely interested in serving. And now that we have 5, we probably have capacity. So when we get that kind of happened, and I will tell you, I think they need a lot of help on that steering committee. So I think there's going to be some reforming and trying to add other members to the steering committee. So maybe we can bring that back to the commissioners as an update, but we're going to move forward and try to get Commissioner Anderson to those meetings.
Sarah, you mentioned a joint commission with Eudora. Did you have some dates that you wanted to suggest on that?
Well, I guess what I'd like commissioners to do is they meet the 2nd and 4th Monday of the month on Mondays. And they could either do it at their regular meeting or at 5:30 before their meeting. What I'd just love for you to do is to send me, if you have any conflicts with the 2nd or 4th Mondays at those timeframes, I'm going to say would probably be March before we'd probably get something on the books just to make sure we get an agenda together, but maybe sooner.
They sounded like sooner is better.
So send me your dates for February, March, and April, and then we can see what their availability is to get it on, if you have any conflicts on those Mondays.
That triggers in terms of in March. Traditionally, we have taken a Wednesday off during spring break. And that just might be something, if commissioners are interested in that, if we want to look at calendars to see if we have a date that works for everybody, or if that's even something that's done this year.
We've talked about this, and this is one of those adjustments with moving to 5 is, when we had 3, we tried to take some times off. So I would just, if it would, to me, be one of those things, if we were going to miss 2 commissioners, it'd probably be worth looking at canceling the meeting and knowing that in advance is helpful, just so that we can let staff know and they can plan accordingly when planning agendas. But in the past, it was sometimes even just 1 commissioner we were looking to cancel. There aren't 5 Wednesdays in March. So that's normally when I get asked by the paper, why did you cancel a meeting? I tell them it's because there are 5 Wednesdays. So I just want to clarify that.
I think that's it for miscellaneous. Anything else, commissioners?
I'm going to be attending Claire's coin rollout tomorrow. And the lady I talked to said Erica might be there and Patrick wouldn't be there. I don't know about the other 2 folks. So I don't know if we have to notice that or not.
Nope.
I'm a maybe, so I appreciate you bringing it up.
So we'll go ahead and notice it. I think I just took care of it today. To me, it's better safe than sorry just to notice it. And so, yeah, commissioners, look at your calendars for March. So if we do want to take the 17th would be the meeting. Is that the day? Is it a Wednesday? Oh, and I also tell you, like, it is insane downtown on the 17th.
Mhm.
So it might be a good day to take off.
You mean
If it-
insane in a good way, right?
Insane.
Mhm.
19th. Oh, it's the
19th.
19th. Never mind. So insane in a great way. Sorry, never mind. I thought it would, if St. Patrick's Day fell on a Wednesday, I would be parking's going to be rough.
I would just offer, I think that something I've decided for myself to just be in the practice of, we're usually pretty good about remembering during this miscellaneous time to talk about some of these dates on our calendar and make sure Robin hears us so that she can properly notice. I think that sometimes the math is going to get a little weird, but it's okay to just always notice it. So I'm going to make a habit of whenever I RSVP to something as a commissioner or put something on my calendar to just let Robin know that and sort of assume that any of those dates, even if it's only one of us attending the public event, that it can land on that list. So I just offer that's going to be my personal practice. We can certainly still discuss it here, but just to move through some of the, will there be 2 or will there be 3 or all 5 of us? If one of us are going to be there, we can let Robin know and it can be noticed.
Thank you, Commissioner Reed. Okay. I think that about covers it. That's enough for tonight. With that, we are adjourned.